I was born into a world where the mountains weren't just landforms, they were beings, ancient and alive. From the earliest memories I can recall, they were there, looming and watching over our small village. My family, like many others, has lived in the shadow of Everest for generations, and it's as if the mountain itself runs through our blood. We Sherpas are bound to the Himalayas by more than just geography. They are our identity, our strength, our challenge, and, in ways difficult to explain, our protectors. Everest isn't just a job for me. It's a calling, a lifelong relationship that can only be understood by those who felt it. Growing up, my mother would tell me stories about the spirits that dwelled in the high places, ancient beings who guarded their home fiercely and would grant safe passage only to those they deemed worthy. She told me that they watched our every step, testing our respect for their sacred grounds. "When you climb Everest," she'd say, "you don't climb alone." These stories weren't just myths. They were part of our reality, a worldview so deep it was woven into the fabric of daily life. I didn't question these tales. They simply were. Every rock, every gust of wind, every shadow was alive with something more than what the eye could see. As I grew, my role in this world took on greater significance. I became a guide, helping climbers from all over the world attempt what, for many, seemed impossible. With every trek, I felt the duality of Everest, the welcoming embrace of the familiar and the humbling reminder of her power. She can be a source of unparalleled beauty, but she is also a place of mystery, where the unknown feels just a heartbeat away. And though I have led countless groups up her steep faces, every journey feels like a new encounter with the unknown. Sometimes I feel she's testing me, reminding me that no matter how well I know her, there are parts of her that remain hidden, veiled in secrets only the mountain understands. One of those secrets unveiled itself to me during a routine trek several years ago. I remember it was early in the season, the sky a wide, unbroken blue that stretched endlessly overhead. Our group was composed of seasoned climbers, people who'd spent years dreaming of the summit, each step a testament to their dedication. The day started perfectly, and we made good progress, winding through the lower paths as I guided the way. The climbers were focused but lighthearted, joking with each other as we climbed higher, everyone in good spirits. Nothing hinted at the experience awaiting us. It started with the fog, something I initially thought was nothing more than a sudden weather shift, common enough in these parts. But this fog was different. It wasn't just creeping in from the edges of our vision, but instead seemed to materialize from the ground itself, like a heavy mist rising up to meet us. In just minutes, our once clear path was swallowed in an impenetrable white, and all sounds softened, dulled, as if the fog had smothered them. I remember stopping, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling as I took in the scene. Fog, after all, was no stranger to us. But this fog, there was something alive about it, something that seemed to watch and wait. The climbers began to notice too, exchanging nervous glances. For a few moments I tried to keep things light, reassuring them that fog was typical, that we just needed to wait it out. But then, in the stillness, there was a noise. A low, guttural growl seemed to reverberate through the mist, faint but undeniably there. I looked around expecting to see an animal, but there was nothing. Just white, endless white, pressing in on all sides. My heart raced as I scanned the surroundings, senses on high alert. The yaks, usually calm and plodding, began to shift uneasily, their eyes wide, snorting in agitation. They sensed it too. This presence, whatever it was no natural phenomenon. I saw them tugging against their leads, trying to pull away, their movements jerky and distressed, warning of something unseen. That's when I first saw the shadow. Just a flicker at the edge of the mist. A shape that moved with intent, not aimless like drifting fog. I squinted, straining to make it out. But every time I tried to focus, it seemed to slip away, a dark outline melting back into the whiteness as if toying with us. The climbers were whispering now, voices laced with a mixture of curiosity and fear, all too aware of the sudden, unnatural silence that had fallen around us. The growling grew louder, surrounding us, yet still faint enough that I couldn't pinpoint where it came from. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, as my instincts screamed that we were not alone. The yaks were nearly frantic, pulling at their ropes, their eyes wild. I knew then that whatever lurked in that fog was something beyond the physical, something ancient, a force we couldn't see but could feel with an intensity that rattled even the most hardened climbers among us. As we stood there, surrounded by the fog and these haunting sounds, I felt a bone-deep urge to turn back, to leave this place that was clearly not meant for us to be in at that moment. But it wasn't fear of the mountain or the elements that pushed this feeling. It was respect for the unseen forces that called this place home. Whatever was out there was watching, observing us with eyes I couldn't see but could sense. It was as if we were intruding uninvited guests in a domain governed by rules we did not understand. Eventually, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the fog began to lift, dissipating as quickly as it had appeared. The growling faded, leaving only an eerie silence and the steady beat of our hearts echoing in our ears. The shadowy forms vanished, leaving us feeling as though we'd just narrowly escaped something we couldn't even name. I caught the eyes of my fellow climbers, each face pale, each person holding a new, profound understanding of the mountain's mysteries. In the years since, I've come to realize that this wasn't an isolated incident, but a part of the Everest experience that few talk about openly. For those who call the Himalayas home, the fog, the shadows, the voices in the silence are reminders of forces that predate our understanding, guardians who patrol their lands with vigilance. That day, we were trespassers in their realm, and their message was clear. We may climb, but the mountain will always hold the final say. That night as we set up camp, the atmosphere felt dense, as if the very air around us was weighted with something unspoken, something watching. It wasn't unusual for climbers to feel anxiety at nightfall in these high places, where the darkness is absolute and the wind whips past like the low moan of a distant spirit. But this night was different, heavier. The fog had lifted, but its presence lingered, like an invisible film clinging to our skin. I kept busy setting up our tents, trying to create a sense of normalcy. But a feeling gnawed at me, a primal instinct that told me we were not alone. After dinner, we all gathered around a small fire, our only source of light and warmth. The flames flickered, casting long, dancing shadows against the rocks and snow around us. Conversation was quiet, almost whispered, each climber lost in their thoughts, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might draw unwanted attention. I could see the apprehension in their eyes, the memory of the fog and those shadowy figures still fresh, lingering in their minds like a dark aftertaste. I tried to reassure them, to say it was just the altitude or the mountain playing tricks on us. But deep down, I didn't believe my own words. I had seen the shapes in the fog, felt their presence as tangibly as the fire's warmth on my face. As the night grew darker, I found myself unable to shake the feeling that something was watching us, lurking just beyond the reach of the firelight. My eyes scanned the perimeter of our camp, and that's when I saw it. Just on the edge of the fire's glow there was a figure, a shadow darker than the night, standing still, as if it had been waiting for me to notice. My breath caught in my throat, and my hands instinctively reached for a rock, anything to defend myself. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, a silent silhouette against the void. It was unlike any living thing, too still, too silent, as if it were part of the night itself. A wave of cold swept over me, colder than anything I'd ever felt, even at these high altitudes. It wasn't the kind of chill that came from outside, but one that seemed to reach into my very bones. I tried to tell myself it was just a shadow, just a trick of the firelight, but deep down, I knew. This was no trick. This was a presence, a being, something ancient and powerful, and it was watching us. I glanced around at the others, wondering if they saw it too, but everyone else seemed lost in their own thoughts or trying desperately to focus on the fire, as if the light could ward off whatever might be lurking in the darkness. I wanted to call out to alert them, but something held me back, a sense of reverence or maybe fear, as though acknowledging it aloud would somehow invite it closer. I stared at the figure, my heart pounding, waiting for it to move, to make its intentions known. But it did nothing. Just remained there, a silent guardian of the night. After what felt like an eternity, the figure slowly faded back into the darkness, disappearing as if it had never been there at all. I sat there, gripping my makeshift weapon, my hands shaking. The others must have sensed my tension, for they looked at me questioningly. But I said nothing, only nodded, trying to convince myself that maybe it was nothing, that maybe I was seeing things. But a part of me knew better. That figure had been there watching, not out of hostility, but with a kind of solemn warning, as if to remind us that we were only guests on this mountain, and our presence was being tolerated, barely. The next morning, the atmosphere remained tense. No one mentioned the events of the night before, but the memory of that shadow lingered in my mind, a reminder of the mountain's mysteries that we couldn't begin to comprehend. As we packed up camp and prepared to continue our ascent, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed, watched by something that moved in the silence, just out of sight. As we resumed our journey, I could sense a change in the group. The lightheartedness from earlier had vanished, replaced by a somber determination, a silent understanding that we were not alone. Each step was heavier, each glance over our shoulders more frequent. It was as though the mountain itself had come alive, each creak and groan of the snow underfoot filled with ominous meaning. As we ascended, the fog returned, but now it was even denser, more aggressive, as if it had been waiting for us to continue. It swirled around us, closing in like a living wall, blurring our vision and deadening all sound. The strange growling returned too, now louder, resonating from all sides, a deep, primal sound that seemed to vibrate through the very earth beneath our feet. The climbers, usually so focused on the goal of reaching the base camp, were visibly unnerved, their pace slowing as they exchanged anxious glances. I felt it too, the sensation of being stalked, pursued by something unseen, something that moved just beyond our field of vision. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. I'd heard stories from other Sherpas, tales of encounters with spirits and guardians of the mountain, but I'd never truly believed them, not until now. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just some animal or a trick of the light. This was something beyond explanation, something that belonged to a world we couldn't see or understand. The growling grew louder, more insistent, as though warning us to turn back, to leave this place while we still could. I could see the fear in the climber's eyes, a silent plea for me to make a decision. Every instinct screamed at me to retreat, to heed the warning that echoed in those guttural sounds. But I also knew that turning back would mean defeat for these climbers, a crushing end to their dream. The mountain demanded respect, yes, but it also required bravery, the kind of courage that defied rational thought. Despite my own fear, I urged the group to press on, each step a defiance of the unknown forces that surrounded us. But as we continued, the sensation grew stronger, more oppressive, until it felt as though we were walking through a wall of dread. The climbers, without a word, began to slow, their movements hesitant, almost as if they too sensed the invisible barrier that barred our way. One by one, they stopped, glancing at each other, unspoken fear etched on their faces. In that moment, it was clear we couldn't go on. I took a deep breath, feeling a strange mix of relief and disappointment. I told them we would turn back, that sometimes the mountain itself made that decision for us, and that no summit was worth the price of ignoring its warnings. They didn't argue, they simply nodded, as if a great weight had been lifted. And as we began our descent, the fog slowly started to recede, the growling fading back into silence, as though whatever force had pursued us was content now, satisfied that we had chosen to retreat. As we walked down, I felt a mixture of awe and fear. The mountain had shown us a glimpse of its power, a reminder that it was a living, breathing force, and that no matter how skilled or brave we might be, we were only human, small, fragile, and temporary in its presence. The spring of 2018 marked the beginning of another season, another expedition, another test of the mountain's temper and my endurance. I was leading a new group, seasoned climbers eager for the challenge and the thrill of reaching Everest's peak. They were a driven, determined group, with that particular gleam in their eyes that all climbers share, the gleam of ambition, of testing limits, of proving something, perhaps to the world, perhaps just to themselves. They had heard of the trials of the mountain, the sheer physical demands, the dangers of weather and altitude, but none of them truly understood what lay ahead. None of them truly understood Everest. This time, our route took us through a more isolated part of the mountain range, far from the usual trekking paths. It was a stretch seldom traversed, with towering rock faces and vast stretches of untouched snow. A place where the silence was profound, almost deafening, as though the world itself had forgotten it. As we entered this lonely, remote region, I felt a shift, a subtle but distinct change in the air. It was something intangible, a feeling that crept in quietly, slowly settling into my bones. It was a sense of being watched, as if the mountain itself was aware of our presence and silently scrutinizing every step we took. As we progressed, the feeling of unease grew stronger. Even the air felt different here, thicker, heavier, with a strange stillness that hung around us like a shroud. Every now and then, I would catch a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting between rocks, or a brief, unexplainable blur in the distance. I would turn to look, but nothing would be there, just the empty landscape, untouched and pristine, as though no one had walked this ground in centuries. The group began to notice too, exchanging glances that grew more uncertain as the hours passed. The usual banter had fallen away, replaced by a tense silence, as everyone focused on the path ahead. But it wasn't just the silence that was unnerving us. It was something deeper, a primal feeling that I couldn't quite put into words, a sensation of trespassing, of crossing an invisible boundary into a place that didn't welcome us. And yet we pushed on, each step an act of determination, defiance, or perhaps stubborn ignorance of what lay ahead. It was late afternoon when we stumbled upon the remains. At first we thought it was a rock formation, a dark mound against the snow, unusual but nothing extraordinary. But as we drew closer, I realized with a sinking feeling that it was something far stranger, far more unsettling. Lying half buried in the snow was a massive figure, covered in thick, coarse fur, its body twisted and broken, its face frozen in a grimace of agony and terror. I knelt beside it, brushing away the snow to reveal more of its form. My heart pounded as I took in the size, the sheer scale of the creature, larger than any human, larger even than the yaks we used to transport our supplies. Its limbs were thick and powerful, ending in enormous hands with long, curved claws that looked as though they could tear through stone itself. This was no animal I had ever seen, no bear or wolf or anything remotely familiar. No, this creature was something else, something that defied explanation. And as I stared at its face, with its deep-set eyes and wide, open mouth frozen in a silent scream, I felt a chill that went beyond the cold of the mountain. I knew without a doubt what this was. The others gathered around, some of them murmuring in confusion, others in shock, but I could see it in their faces. The dawning realization, the shared recognition of the creature before us. There was only one name that came to mind, a name that had lived in the whispered tales of my people for generations. The Yeti. For centuries, the Yeti had been a figure of legend, a ghostly creature that roamed the highest, most desolate reaches of the Himalayas. Some said it was a guardian of the mountain, others a vengeful spirit, while others still dismissed it as mere folklore, a myth created to explain the unexplainable. But here in front of us lay proof, tangible, undeniable evidence of its existence. I felt a strange mix of fear and awe, a deep respect for this creature that had lived hidden in the remote crags of Everest, known only to the whispers of those who called this place home. But as I examined the body, a sense of dread began to creep over me. This Yeti hadn't died from natural causes. Its injuries were too severe, too violent. The bones were shattered, the flesh torn and mangled as though by something larger, something even more powerful. I looked around, suddenly aware of the vast emptiness that surrounded us, the deep silence that felt less like peace and more like a waiting, an anticipation. I wondered what could have killed such a creature. What force could have been powerful enough to take down something as formidable as the Yeti? As we stood there, silence enveloped us, the weight of our discovery sinking in. The air felt thick with an unspoken warning, an invisible tension that seemed to press in from all sides. I glanced at the others and saw my own fear reflected in their faces, a mixture of awe, horror, and the dawning realization that we were in the presence of something far greater, something that had existed long before we had, and would continue long after we were gone. In that moment, I felt the mountain's presence more acutely than ever. It was as if the very ground beneath us pulsed with a kind of awareness, a consciousness that defied understanding. We had crossed into a place of secrets, a realm where humans were not meant to tread. I could feel it in my bones, in the icy air that filled my lungs. This place was sacred, a domain of ancient beings and forces beyond our comprehension. And now, here we were, intruders in a world that was not ours, standing over the body of one of its guardians. After a moment, I urged the group to move on, feeling the unshakable sense that we were not safe here, that whatever had killed the Yeti might still be close. The climbers seemed relieved, and we left quickly, each step taking us farther from the body but never truly shaking the fear that had settled into our minds. As we walked, I couldn't stop thinking about the Yeti, about the stories my mother had told me as a child. She had always spoken of the Yeti with reverence, describing it as a spirit of the mountain, a creature that commanded respect, something you might see only if it allowed you to. Yet here, we had found it, lifeless, broken, defeated. That night, as we set up camp far from the site, I lay awake, staring at the sky, my mind racing with questions. I felt a new kind of fear, a deeper understanding of the mountain and its inhabitants. The Yeti had been powerful, and yet something even greater had ended its life with brutal finality. I realized then that the mountain was home to forces beyond human comprehension, forces that didn't adhere to our rules, our sense of reality. We were guests here, temporary, fleeting, and the mountain tolerated our presence only as long as we respected it. But we had crossed a line, ventured into a place we had no business exploring, and I knew deep down that whatever was out there, watching from the shadows, was aware of us now, its gaze following us as we moved deeper into its territory. The mountain, in all its silent, towering grandeur, was alive, aware, and unforgiving. And in that moment, lying beneath the vast night sky, I understood that we were at its mercy. The storm hit with a ferocity that felt almost personal, as if the mountain itself had summoned it to test our resolve, to strip us of any illusion of control we still clung to. The sky turned dark so suddenly that it was as if the sun had been blotted out, swallowed by the clouds that churned and swelled above us. The wind roared through the peaks, shrieking and howling as it picked up shards of ice and snow, flinging them at us like needles that pierced through our clothing and bit into our skin. Within minutes, visibility dropped to nearly zero, the world around us swallowed by a swirling white vortex. I could barely see my own hand in front of my face, let alone the others. We huddled together, trying to stay close, trying to keep our footing as the ground seemed to shift beneath us. Each step felt treacherous, a gamble against the mountain's unyielding will. The air grew thin, colder than I had ever felt, seeping into my bones, chilling me to the core. The storm was relentless, and I felt a deep sense of foreboding that went beyond the physical dangers we faced. It was as though we had crossed an invisible threshold, and the mountain was punishing us for our trespass, sending this storm as a warning, a reminder of our fragility. And then, through the blinding snow and shrieking wind, I felt it, the unmistakable presence, a force that was both close and vast, surrounding us like the air itself. I couldn't see it, not yet, but every fiber of my being sensed it, a presence that defied explanation. It was the same feeling I'd felt in the fog, in the shadows, but now it was amplified, raw and primal. I could feel it watching me, an ancient intelligence that seemed to fill the space around us, pressing down on us with a weight that went beyond physicality. It was as if the mountain itself had taken form, a guardian, an enforcer of boundaries we had dared to cross. And then there it was. A massive, towering figure emerged from the storm, its form barely discernible through the wall of snow. It was larger than any living thing I had ever seen, a shadow that loomed against the blizzard, a being that seemed to embody the very essence of the mountain. The creature's outline was rough, with powerful, broad shoulders, long, muscular limbs, and a head that seemed almost human but far more fierce, more ancient, with eyes that glowed a dull, almost mournful red. Those eyes were fixed on me, and in that moment, I felt like a child, insignificant, a mere speck in the face of this primordial force. It stood there, unmoving, like a monument carved from stone, an embodiment of everything wild and untamed about the mountain. Its fur was thick, matted with snow and ice, blending into the storm itself so seamlessly that it seemed to fade in and out of existence, as if it were part of the mountain, part of the storm. I felt my heart pounding, my breath shallow and cold in my chest, as I realized that I was alone, the others lost somewhere in the white chaos. But in that moment, I could only focus on the creature, on those burning eyes that held me captive, unyielding, unblinking. I knew what it was without needing to ask, without a shred of doubt. This was no bear, no animal, no mere creature of flesh and bone. This was a spirit of the mountain, a being of legend, a force that had existed long before humans ever dared to set foot on these peaks. It was the guardian I had felt watching us in the fog, the same presence I'd sensed since we had begun our journey. And now it stood before me, a manifestation of all the mysteries and terrors that Everest held in its frozen heart. For a moment we simply stared at each other, locked in a silent standoff. I felt a strange calm settle over me, a sense of inevitability, as though I had always known this encounter would come. There was no fear now, just a profound respect, a deep understanding that I was in the presence of something far greater than myself, something timeless and powerful, a creature that carried within it the spirit of the mountain, its strength, its endurance, its indifference to human ambition. And then it moved. The creature let out a low, rumbling growl, a sound that seemed to resonate from the core of the earth itself. The ground beneath my feet trembled, a subtle vibration that grew stronger, filling the air with a palpable energy. The sound wasn't just audible, it was something I felt deep within, as though the mountain itself were speaking, conveying a message in a language I couldn't fully understand but instinctively recognized. It took a step forward, its massive foot sinking into the snow, and I felt an overwhelming urge to retreat, to turn and run, but I was rooted to the spot, held by those unblinking eyes. And then, just as suddenly, the creature stopped, its growl fading into silence. It tilted its head, studying me, and in that moment, something shifted. I felt a strange connection, a mutual recognition, a sense that we were both bound to this mountain in ways that transcended words or understanding. It was as if the creature saw something in me, something that mirrored its own nature, a respect, a reverence for the mountain's ancient power. I couldn't explain it, but I felt that in that instant the creature understood me, acknowledged me. Then, in an almost gentle motion, it took a step back, its massive form slowly fading into the storm, disappearing as silently as it had appeared. The wind began to die down, the snow settling, and in the sudden stillness I realized that I had been spared, granted a reprieve. I had faced the mountain's guardian, and somehow it had chosen not to harm me. I felt a deep, humbling gratitude, a sense of awe that left me speechless, as though I had been given a glimpse into a world far beyond human comprehension. As the storm passed, I found myself standing alone in the vast, silent expanse of snow, the mountains stretching out before me, calm once more. The others emerged, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear and confusion, but they asked no questions. They sensed the weight of what had happened, the significance of the encounter, even if they hadn't seen it themselves. We all knew in our own way that we had come face to face with something extraordinary, something that went beyond the natural world. I took one last look at the spot where the creature had stood, feeling a strange sense of peace, a connection to the mountain that was deeper than anything I had ever felt. In that moment, I understood that this place was alive, that the mountain was not just rock and ice, but a living entity, a force that watched over its own, protecting, testing, and occasionally sparing those who showed it respect. As we made our way down the mountain, I felt a profound change within me, a new understanding of my place in this world, of the mountain's ancient guardianship and the secrets it kept. I knew that I would carry this experience with me for the rest of my life, a reminder that the mountains are more than mere landscapes. They are realms of spirit and power, alive with forces that defy human understanding. And as we left the heights of Everest behind, I felt both humbled and honored, grateful for the gift of survival, for the chance to walk away with my life and the knowledge that I had stood face to face with the mountain's soul. It was a silent parting, a farewell unspoken, but I felt its presence linger, a shadow in the distance, watching, always watching, as we made our way back to the world below.